Hello, everyone. Good morning from Washington, D.C., and greetings to you all, whichever part of the world you are in. Yes, my name is Venkataputti. I'm a program manager at the World Bank in the Carbon Markets and Innovation Unit, which, among other things, coordinates the organization of the Innovate for Climate, which is going on right now. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you at this workshop on pricing carbon from readiness to implementation. The context for this workshop is those two phrases in the workshop title, readiness and implementation. At the World Bank, we have been implementing the Partnership for Market Readiness, PMR, for over a decade, supporting the countries in building their market capacity, domestic infrastructure, and policy making to be able to use explicit carbon pricing instruments, emissions trading, carbon taxation, or carbon offsets. After supporting 23 countries, building capacity of nearly 20,000 professionals, producing over 50 industry standard publications, and providing a knowledge exchange platform for about 50 countries, the PMR will formally end next month in June 2021. In fact, this workshop is the last of a series of 11 workshops that we have held over the last 2 months, the PMR Perspectives series, to celebrate the successful implementation of the PMR and reflect on its achievements and learnings. As a successor to the PMR, we recently launched the Partnership for Market Implementation, PMI, which, as the name suggests, is aimed at supporting countries in implementing carbon pricing. Over the next 10 years, we hope to cover at least 30 countries in this endeavor. We feel the timing is right for this transition from readiness to implementation. Carbon pricing is growing its momentum, and more countries and jurisdictions are looking to use it as a mitigation tool. As shown in the latest State and Trends report on carbon pricing, which was launched yesterday here at the I4C, there were 64 ongoing carbon pricing initiatives raising $45 billion in 2020. And nearly 100 parties to the Paris Agreement included carbon pricing in their NDCs as a mitigation option. So carbon pricing is here to stay and grow. In fact, if you attended the plenary that just ended today at I4C on carbon pricing, several governments, companies, and banks have reiterated this message and emphasized the role of carbon pricing in reaching to the net zero goals that many countries are adopting. Of course, while there are many benefits that accrue from carbon pricing, there are also many challenges. Chief among them is the need to set them up in a way that maximizes the gains for all sections of the society and minimizes the potentially adverse socioeconomic impacts. This is exactly the topic of today's discussion, and we have a fabulous set of panelists to reflect on these matters and provide their views on how to take the carbon pricing momentum forward so as to realize its true potential in meeting the Paris goals. In other words, how do you achieve this decarbonization through a just transition process? So it is my great pleasure to welcome the panelists. And now let me quickly introduce them before I request them for their interventions. Firstly, we have two global champions of climate action representing two of the most widely known think tanks in the world. Mr. Manuel Pulgar Vidal is the global leader of climate and energy at the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, and is a global ambassador for Race to Zero. He is a former Minister of Environment in Peru, in which capacity he kindly hosted one of the PMR global assemblies in Lima. He was the president of COP20 held in Peru, and his contribution to the Paris Agreement has been widely recognized. Then we have Dr. Helen Mountford. She is the Vice President for Climate and Economics at the World Resources Institute. She co-chairs the Net Zero Task Force established by the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. Among her work in innumerable areas, she also co-leads the WRI's Build Back Better, a country support initiative for COVID-19 recovery. Then we have two young leaders representing two of the important stakeholders in the carbon pricing movement. Ms. Corina Mocanu is policy officer at the European Commission. After a wide experience in energy markets, Corina moved to the Directorate General for Climate Action in the Commission to work on bilateral and multilateral cooperation. And in that capacity, she acts as the focal point for the PMR as well as the PMI initiatives we at the World Bank implement. I might also mention that the European Commission has been the largest contributing donor to the PMR. Finally, Dr. Chris Shipley is head of the global carbon markets at the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department of the United Kingdom and manages UK's climate finance and policy to promote carbon markets internationally. Chris also oversees UK's participation in the PMR, PMI programs, and UK is the largest contributor to the PMI. So with those brief introductions, I would like to welcome our panelists once more and would like to request Manuel to start the proceedings by making his initial intervention.
Thank you very much, Venkata, and hello to you all. Hello, Helen. Well honored of being part of this workshop to talk exactly about from readiness to implementation. And let me start by celebrating the almost 6 years of the PMR and all what it has done under the PMR to promote that readiness that we need in the world to achieve our objective. And yesterday I was thinking how to start these 4 minutes remarks. And I thought that it would be good to recognize so important communique of the G7. For them who have not already read it, do it. I think that that communique of Ministry of the Environment and Energy of the G7, it is one of the most integral and integrative documents I've ever seen, in which paragraph 24, they recognize the potential of carbon markets and carbon pricing to foster cost-effective reduction emissions in different levels. I think that is a very good phrase to recognize that, as you said, Venkata, carbon pricing, it has arrived, it has gotten to be here in a permanent way. So I am going to use these 4 minutes just to recognize two things. The momentum for carbon pricing has been built, and it is based in some foundation. But still, there are some limits that we should sort as a way to have a more effective implementation of carbon pricing in the different levels, mostly in developing countries. So I am going to refer to the foundations in a very short time. First, carbon pricing, it is strongly related to net zero. And fortunately, and this is really important, the net zero concept, it has become to be a collective vision for the world. Everybody knows that if we put the century ahead of the world, we know what are we planning to achieve by the end of the century. So to not raise temperature in more than 1.5, by the half of the century to get a net zero and resilient economy, and by 2030, in which we are expecting at least 50% of emission reduction raising, so to raise ambition. So net zero, it is a good concept that can frame carbon pricing policies. But also it is important to recognize as foundation the role of science and what IPCC has told us by talking about the 4 transitions: the energy, the industry, the infrastructure and cities, and the land use and deforestation and reforestation transition. Also, we're in a time in which we are walking this strong campaign of the race to zero. And the race to zero, it is not a competition, or in some way it could be seen as a competition. It's a competition of responsible actors that are defining clear targets based on science as a way to achieve the objective for a net zero economy, in which science-based target, it is a key element for credibility in that race to zero. And finally, we have the NDCs. And the NDCs are the most important planning document for countries because it's defining their own strategies and their own actions to achieve that main objective. So that is a good foundation for implementing carbon pricing policies. But still there are limits. And I do prefer to focus more on the limits as a way to be effective in the implementation. First limit, probably the limit of the pandemics. We know how much the pandemics has affected carbon pricing policies, as the fiscal system has been focused in attending the pandemic and not the importance of this kind of policies. So I have a suggestion. Let's talk on how carbon pricing policies should be an integral part of recovery packages. That is some narrative that we must develop. So if we are able to communicate that the carbon pricing can help countries, mostly developing, in the recovery time for a Build Back Better, that could be very effective in the implementation of carbon pricing policy. The second element, it is in many developing countries, the lack of involvement of Minister of Finance. As we know, fortunately, because of Chile and Finland, they launched this coalition of Minister of Finance. Currently, there are around 60 ministers that are participating, but mostly from developed countries. We do need to encourage developing country Minister of Finance to be part of that coalition. Because the Helsinki Principles and the Santiago Action Plan, it's defining carbon pricing as one of those main policies that we should address. This debate, it is not just for Minister of the Environment. It is mostly for Minister of Finance. And we do need to encourage them to be effective part of this discussion. A third element, and probably this one of the most important, it is that despite that we have gotten good NDCs in many places, we haven't yet gotten good long-term strategies. And look, if we have the NDC, that is clear for short-term action. But if that short-term action, it is not well linked with a long-term strategy, with a clear vision by 2050 and with clear strategies, it is more difficult to implement. So we do need to continue encouraging countries to develop their long-term strategy to define a clear net zero 2050 with clear strategies and more clear targets. A fourth element that we should limit, it is the populism and also the energy security concept. We know that unfortunately, and I am from South America, in South America, the dependence of fossil fuels and all the concept of energy security, that it is strongly framed by geopolitics, are limiting the adoption of carbon pricing. Fortunately, the PMR released some months ago a good document on how much carbon pricing can support well the energy security concept. That is something in which we should continue insisting. Also, and let me switch into the carbon markets topic, it is important to work in high integrity on demand and supply for the carbon markets. That is going to bring more credibility in a time in which we are still discussing the Article 6. And my last 2 points, the one, it is offsets. We know that still there are a lot of divergences in relation to the role that offset would play in the net zero concept. That is something that we must address. And finally, the concept that you raised, Venkata, about the just transition. We should remind what happened in France with the yellow vest. And we do need to know that a carbon pricing policy should consider social consideration. That is a key element if we don't want to fail. So those are the limits that I hope it could help to frame a new time in which we are going to move from readiness to implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel. I think you have touched upon many very important concepts as we take the carbon pricing movement forward. So now let me turn to Helen for her intervention. I believe she has a couple of slides to show. So Alejandra, can you put them up, please?
Thank you so much, Venkata, and it's wonderful to be here with you today to celebrate both what the PMR has achieved so far, but also as we go forward, what this means in terms of helping support carbon pricing implementation. I think this is exactly the right moment. And what I want to speak to today is very much a complement to what Manuel just said, and really talking a little bit more about some of the momentum we've been seeing, the exciting momentum we've been seeing around climate action and the role of carbon pricing in that, but also the importance of actually getting the right rules and guardrails around this so that it can achieve the kind of ambition we need on climate, so it can deliver the social and jobs and economic benefits, and so that it can do so in a way which is just and equitable. So first, just to start, just to say that we have seen global momentum really around tackling the climate crisis, even during this period of the COVID pandemic. It's really been quite amazing to see this shifting into high gear the last year and a half. At the moment, we've got 121 countries that have pledged to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and already 59 countries that have put net zero targets into law, into policy, or into clear political statements. So we're really starting to see that coming from countries. We also have many states, cities, businesses who are signing up to the science-based targets, and investors that are setting similar net zero targets. An astounding 160 asset managers, owners, and banks who are responsible for over $70 trillion in assets globally have committed to net zero emissions across their portfolios by 2050 now. While this momentum is welcome and very much needed, an important gap still remains between these long-term goals and the actions that we're seeing being taken now as part of the economic recovery and the targets that countries and others are setting in the intermediate term. So we need a 2030 climate targets that really align with these net zero targets. But as you can see from the figures here, we've got about 60% of global emissions, countries responsible for 60% of global emissions that haven't yet submitted their new or updated NDC. And we need to see those before Glasgow in a way which actually aligns with this ambition. We also need to see these kinds of intermediary targets and clear pathways to get to net zero for the businesses and for the investors that are making these targets, putting these targets in place. And we need transparent ways that they can report against these, the progress they are making, and being held to account for all. So carbon pricing can be a very powerful tool as part of a broader toolkit to incentivize the sectoral transformations that Manuel described and align the investments we need to decarbonize the economy, scale up carbon removal, including through forests and trees, and spur innovation. So it can be a really effective tool to help us do this. But we do know it's also not a silver bullet. And more, I think, as you're going forward with the implementation agenda, more attention needs to be put in place on the broader policy package, how carbon pricing plays a role in that, how it can do so in a way which is robust and leads to more ambition, not watering down ambition, and how can it be employed in a way that really does support a just transition and equity. Those will be essential. If we go to the next slide, Alejandra. You've probably already seen this morning if you've been watching the I4C events, but we've seen the latest evidence coming out of the World Bank and around the growing momentum on carbon pricing. According to the latest report just out, we've got 64 carbon pricing instruments in operation now and 3 scheduled to start any moment. Altogether, these cover over 1/5 of global emissions, up from just 1% back in 2004. And they include, as you can see from this chart, they include major economies like China, all European countries, Canada, Argentina, South Africa. So growing momentum around the world. The different colors show whether it's a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme, whether it's implemented or coming shortly. In addition, one of the important things that we've noted, particularly in the time of the COVID recovery, is that carbon pricing can also be a very important instrument in terms of raising government revenues. And in 2020, the latest figures around the world were about $53 billion raised in carbon pricing revenues, and the potential is there for much more. Really important in order to help support that just transition and equity and create the right framework conditions to move forward with carbon pricing. So while we see these fantastic developments and momentum and the climate ambition out there, even in the context of this global recovery, we also see a lot of questions coming up on how carbon pricing will be achieved, how the climate ambition will be achieved, and how to ensure it is done in a way that is robust, is just, and equitable. And in some cases, what we're seeing is that there's a lack of common understanding, even around what net zero means and what a credible transition looks like, even as companies, countries, and others are coming forward with these targets. So a key question is, what does that look like? And what is the appropriate role of carbon pricing? That is why the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition has set up a task force on net zero and carbon pricing, which I'm very honored to chair together with Mauricio Cardenas, the former finance minister of Colombia. And we're working with experts across business, think tanks, and countries to really look at contributing to a common understanding of net zero and to explore the role of carbon pricing in supporting the transition to net zero. So we've just put out a draft report for consultation. We very much welcome feedback. As we said, Venkat, it's very much aligned with what you're doing in the PMR and moving towards this phase of implementation, linking it to the global ambition we're seeing on climate action. So thank you very much and look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I think that's a very nice summary of exactly where we are and where we should be going as far as carbon pricing is concerned. So now let me turn to our Corina from European Commission. So Corina, please go ahead with your intervention.
Thank you, Venkat. Good morning, good afternoon to all the participants. First, let me thank you for your invitation to this event, which marks a key moment of transition between the Partnership for Market Readiness to the Partnership for Market Implementation. And I think it's a great opportunity to take stock of the PMR achievements and use lessons learned from the PMR to ensure that the PMI will be a successful continuation of the work to promote robust carbon pricing across the world. As you mentioned in the beginning, the European Commission has been engaged as the largest donor throughout these 10 years, reaching activities promoting carbon pricing as a tool to tackle climate change across the world. As you know, the EU is operating one of the oldest and the largest emissions trading system. And as such, we are a strong supporter of carbon pricing. We see it as a tool, a very cost-effective tool to provide businesses the flexibility to reduce emissions in the best way for them. Thus being one of the most cost-effective instruments to reduce emissions. The EU ETS has a key role to play in the green recovery. As also previous speakers mentioned, we see this as a key tool in our recovery from the COVID crisis and in our path towards climate neutrality. We see carbon pricing as a win-win tool for our economies, as on the one hand, it fosters competitiveness and growth, while helping the environment and ensuring that polluters pay. We at the European Commission are convinced that climate action is good for businesses. Decarbonization and economic growth should go hand in hand if you want to have competitive and future-proof economies. We put the climate action at the core of recovery strategies within the European Green Deal to ensure a transition towards more sustainable and resilient economies. In addition to providing an economic incentive to reduce emissions, a big advantage of carbon pricing, such as ETS or carbon taxes, is linked to the use of revenues. And as previous speakers also rightly mentioned, the social aspect is very important in this context. The redistribution of revenues from the EU ETS, for instance, is an important tool to ensure a just transition, which doesn't leave anyone behind. EU ETS revenues are used for funding innovation in key sectors, but also modernization of energy systems in the poorer member states, working alongside to the Just Transition Fund. As contributing partner to the PMR, we have been happy to share our experience with others as they look for appropriate tools to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement. And we think that the PMR has provided the means to reach out to a very large number of participants to share the necessary knowledge and build the capacity needed for implementing carbon pricing. PMR also showed its capacity to adapt to a very rapidly changing international context. It had an evolving role with the adoption of Paris Agreement, which was a big game changer for the international and domestic climate action. By its capacity building activities, financial support and knowledge sharing, PMR has supported implementing countries in their efforts to identify and implement the most appropriate carbon pricing measures to support domestic ambition in line with Paris commitments. And we are happy to see that the PMR has made a real impact to date in building country readiness on carbon pricing. A particular strength of the program, in our view, has been the knowledge and best practices exchange that has taken place in the program, thanks to the community of carbon pricing practitioners that the PMR has created. However, now we need to do more. To meet the Paris Agreement goals, we need to step up ambition. And it is now time to move to implementation and put in place robust policies to address domestic emissions and start the investment needed for decarbonization for climate neutrality. In this context, we see the Partnership for Market Implementation as a logical successor of the PMR, with a special focus on assisting countries to implement explicit carbon pricing instruments in an attempt to move from readiness to actual implementation. This is a very welcome evolution, as we see countries that successfully completed preparatory steps under the PMR and are now ready to move to actual implementation of carbon pricing instruments. However, countries that are not ready yet for implementation will still be able to apply for funding for readiness activities. And this is important, as this will give opportunity to new countries, in particular those that were not part of the PMR, to undertake preparatory steps in view of a future implementation of carbon pricing. The European Commission is very happy to be part of the PMI, and we are looking forward to the upcoming activities. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Corina. So now I would like to request Chris to make his intervention, but I also would like to request the participants, as we have the last intervention, if you have any questions, please come into the chat box and enter your questions there. So, Chris.
Thank you, Venkat. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much as well for joining this session. Before discussing PMI, I just wanted to talk briefly about some carbon pricing developments in the UK related to the Emissions Trading Scheme, because I think if you want to promote carbon pricing internationally, then you have to walk the walk domestically as well. So, we've got a long-standing commitment to carbon pricing here in the UK. It's a key part of our approach to achieving our net zero target. We were closely involved in the development design of the EU ETS, and our carbon price floor has helped to drive a big reduction in our power sector emissions. Recently, the UK ETS launched on the 1st of January this year, with a cap set 5% below the UK's notional share of the EU ETS cap for phase 4. The first auctions took place last week, and UK allowances have since been trading for around between 49 and 55 euros. Unfortunately, this took place after the publication of the World Bank's State and Trends report, which I think lists UK allowance prices as at their slightly lower reserve price. And in the near future, we'll be looking at how we align the UK ETS cap with our net zero target. We'll be reviewing free allocation, and we'll be considering how the scope of the UK ETS might be expanded. And finally, recognising the importance of international cooperation on carbon pricing, and the UK is open to linking the UK ETS internationally in principle, and we're considering a range of options. So that's the domestic picture. Internationally, look, we've seen again in this year's World Bank's Trends, although the coverage of carbon pricing is increasing, and that is welcome. When you look at the carbon price that's applied to those emissions, you find that very few of them, I think it says less than 4%, are consistent with 2-degree trajectories. At the same time, all the evidence on carbon pricing points one way, including Manuel referenced the IPCC, which says in its 1.5-degree report that carbon pricing must have a role to play in all 1.5-degree scenarios. So these are parts of the reasons why we've given more money to the PMI this time round, £20 million compared to £7 million for the previous programme. Corina ran through lots of the successes of PMR, which I agreed with. I think that the development and implementation of a range of different approaches that are geared towards implementing country preferences and interests has been a big success. You know, we've had anecdotal evidence that the knowledge products PMR has generated has been instrumental in reforming some countries' carbon taxes, for instance. So looking ahead under PMI, you know, I think in short, we want to see the breadth, depth, number of carbon pricing instruments increase, and for this to be reflected in increased NDC ambition. Once these instruments are implemented, though, it's important to note, obviously, that they remain susceptible to political and economic shocks. This isn't something that's limited just to PMR countries. It's a universal issue. So a big challenge, I think, under implementation will be, you know, implementation isn't, well, once something is implemented, you then have to increase the coverage, you have to increase the ambition in the system, and how countries, I think, anticipate and mitigate, respond to these kinds of shocks, and how they communicate those lessons through PMI and beyond will be really important. You know, yeah, I think PMR provided a good collaborative platform for the exchange of ideas and expertise and experience. I think we should probably acknowledge that we don't have any implementing countries on the panel today, but I think the reason for that is that PMI is at an early stage, and so implementing countries for PMI haven't quite been identified yet, but hopefully that will happen very soon. Other interests in PMI, look, it's exciting that it could potentially open the door to the trade of international carbon credits. So we've seen under PMR some implementing countries allowing participants under carbon pricing instruments to use domestic offsets. You know, if it was in the implementing country's interests and preference to internationalize that, then I think that would be quite exciting. And then finally, Venkat and other panelists spoke about just transition, and I think this is really important to us. So, you know, as carbon pricing coverage increases, so is the imperative to make sure that communities that fall under those policies aren't made poorer as a result, and that, you know, social and environmental justice issues are responded to. We've been working with PMI partners on this issue, including through a working group that's been set up to discuss the issue. And I think just from my side, probably quick thoughts on how to help guarantee a just transition. That you've got to consult broadly and early with all your stakeholder groups to give time and space to understand impacts and concerns. You know, you can think about how revenue is recycled, including back to those communities that are most effective. You could think about how revenues are used to invested in community projects for relevant communities, and think about how the carbon pricing instrument relates to the broader suite of policies, environmental and otherwise, that are in place and that those communities are subject to. So how do those policies all interact in the end for those communities? So yeah, supporting countries to put fair and robust carbon price in place while safeguarding these kinds of just transition concerns, competitiveness concerns, is a really ambitious challenge, but it's one we have to tackle, and we're looking forward to doing that with PMI partners. Thanks.
So thanks to all the panelists for making some really important points. We are now, I think, down to the last 13 minutes of our event. So we now will turn to the questions and answer session. And I have one question I see on European to the European Commission, which is on how the EU ETS prices can actually help the voluntary initiatives. Corina, would you like to quickly react to that?
Hello, sorry. Yes, thank you, Venkat. Yeah, I would just like to recall that The EU ETS is a compliance instrument. It's being reviewed currently to contribute to our 2030 and 2050 climate neutrality goal. Our targets are domestic, so we don't envisage at this stage the use of international credits, except for international aviation. We have not established the relationship between the ETS and Article 6, but we have a link that is operational since 2020 with Switzerland, and we are committed to applying it to international trades. So yeah, that's what I can say.
Great, thank you, Corina. And then there is another question on the role World Bank and others are playing in terms of bringing carbon pricing to Africa. Let me just quickly respond to that. Yes, it is true that in the PMR, we had only 3 countries from African continent looking at carbon pricing. But over the last 10 years, I think there are several more African nations which have paid closer attention to carbon pricing as a mitigation option. And there are regional initiatives that are going on in Africa right now, in which many countries are members and are looking at the needs for capacity building, policy making, etc. And also in the latest program that we have launched, the PMI, we now have expressions of interest from at least 10 African countries. And we actually hope to have a larger footprint as far as our program is concerned in Africa in the near future. I think there is progress on that, but obviously we need to accelerate it further.
Can I jump, Venkata, into that
yes,
question?
Please.
Okay, thank you. That is an interesting one. And when Helen showed that map of the world, if we draw the equator line, we know that below that line probably there are just few countries with clear carbon pricing policies. And probably that is related to what I tried to raise. What are those limits that we still need to sort? But let me say something that for me it's important, Helen, you have heard me to talk about of this. I think that in some way the lack of understanding that we are entering into a new and emerging and a strong climate economy, it is causing that difficulty. That for me, it is key. That is a key part of our narrative. You know, I am going to say something weird. No, here I am based in Peru. Now I am used to saying, forget for a bit the Paris Agreement. That for sure, I am one of the most important pushers of the agreement. But what I'm trying to say to decision makers, it is not about an agreement. It is about the economy. And that message, it is an important one. And Ricardo Lagos, former president of Chile, in an event some months ago, said this: probably we are going to switch from the GDP way of measuring our economy to a volume of carbon of our product. So the efficiency is going to be measured with that new measure line, the volume of carbon. With that kind of narrative, we could be more able to convince developing countries that this is not something from the north, that it is something that it could charge too much into a price, that it is about the economy and the future of our own economy. So that narrative, it is for me key if we want to address what Diana mentioned in relation, for example, to Africa and also South America. So the South, mostly the South, that have not already understood the importance of the carbon pricing in this new economy.
Thank you, Manuel. So, this question on Africa really touches upon the whole concept of just transition. So, Helen, I don't know if you want to say a couple of words around that.
Thanks very much, Venkat. And I very much agree with Manuel. Even if you put aside the climate crisis and what we need to tackle that, moving forward on climate ambition, on transforming our economies to be more competitive, clean, more efficient, This is what's going to create jobs. This is what's going to position us well for the future. And this is what's going to actually boost growth. So we've seen this clearly as part of the economic recovery. A number of countries are starting to seize on this because energy efficiency, renewable energies, restoring degraded lands, these create double or even up to as much as 7 times as many jobs as the same investments in fossil fuels. So if you want to boost your economy coming out of the crisis, it's much better to be investing in these clean, green alternatives. Now, carbon pricing is an interesting one. I think Manuel is right. It's something which a lot of countries have seen as something that was really Europe. Europe was doing carbon pricing. We're not entirely sure why and not entirely sure how it was working, but it's now starting to spread. I think the exciting things we see are South Africa last year, China going economy-wide. We see more and more developing and emerging economies, Argentina, Brazil. I mean, we've got many who are starting to do carbon pricing, Mexico, in ways that we haven't seen before. And so starting to have that evidence and starting to see how that is working and helping to achieve growth, helping to use the revenues in ways which actually ensure that low-income households, middle-income households are better off, not worse off under carbon pricing, doing so in ways where they can actually recycle some of the revenues, as Chris mentioned, to actually help support vulnerable communities. I think as we start to see that evidence grow, we'll see a very different approach in other countries. And South Africa is one particularly to watch because President Ramaphosa has put together a Just Transition Commission. So they're doing the carbon pricing, but they're also saying we cannot do this. We cannot actually go to a low carbon economy unless we do it in a way which is just and equitable. And we will achieve that in South Africa. So I think South Africa is going to be particularly exciting to watch over the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, Helen. There are a few questions coming in and we are fast running out of time, but let me quickly turn to this question and maybe ask Manuel to respond to it since he's a former politician. Since politicians stay in the office only for 4 or 5 years, how can you ensure long-term sustainability of carbon pricing?
I'm going to be extremely short for this because this has been said by Helen and myself, the importance of long-term strategy. If we are not able to connect our current and desired actions through the NDCs, that also Helen raised this point, we are still waiting for 60% of the work. That is too much of something that we expected it should have been fulfilled by the end of 2020. But okay, if we are not able to connect the current NDC with the short-term action with something that it is the vision, that is not a good way of defining how achievable our actions could be. So long-term strategies by 2050, it is key. And let me reiterate the importance of this G7 communique. It's extremely good because it is not only connecting to that vision for climate, but also connecting for that a vision for nature with the concept of nature positive and the vision for health with the One Health approach. So I think that communique could be translated in our countries as a way to help decision makers to finally put on the table a clear long-term strategy. So that is for me the key way to avoid a 4 or 5 years, because it is true, it is used to happening that 4 or 5 years, it is not enough to install well a policy. But by keeping that long-term vision, it could be more possible.
Thank you very much. I think we are down to the last 3 minutes or so, but one last question on carbon leakage and the ways to address that. So I'm wondering if Chris, you would like to make a quick intervention on that, and then we can start wrapping up.
Yeah, thanks, Venkat. Happy to. I think, yeah, look, as we transition to net zero, I think we're well aware of the importance of addressing the risk of carbon leakage, just to ensure that ambitious decarbonisation policies aren't undermined. There are a range of approaches that could help to achieve that, I think. One of which obviously is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which the European Commission is considering. We're following that debate with interest as the UK. We see it as one of many options. And I think we'll just assess potential measures as they become clearer and continue to work multilaterally to secure ambitious climate outcomes.
Thank you. Okay, so we have the last 2 minutes, so we would like to kind of close, and I apologize to the other participants who have sent in the questions. If necessary, we could take them up bilaterally with you, but thank you for those questions. And I'm not actually planning to make a very long summary of it because I have my colleague Rayleigh who is going to actually show it pictorially in terms of all the different points that have been made by the panelists. But I would like to make 3 conclusions from the overall discussion. One, I think, is it's very clear that the timing is right and opportune for carbon pricing to make its mark as a strong mitigation tool. But there is a need to align it with other policies and also integrate it into the other long-term strategies that the countries are developing, including, of course, reflecting that ambition in the NDCs as they are getting updated. And the third is, the need to be inclusive in terms of making sure that all the sections of the society relevant to this process are included in the consultations early on, and a very conscious effort is made to ensure that potentially negative impacts, at least in the initial stages of implementing carbon pricing instruments, are minimized in the best way possible. So these are the 3 broad conclusions, but we are, of course, very much looking forward to operationalizing the Partnership for Market Implementation, through which we are going to be reaching many more countries, including hopefully many countries in Africa and other underdeveloped regions. So we look forward to working with all of you in that process. So in terms of capturing all the different points that have come through in this session, I would now request Rayleigh to project her picture.
Thanks, Venkata. Yep, you can see it on the spotlight.
Yeah.
And there are 2 slides today, so this is one of those 2. Thanks so much.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So, along with the workshop proceedings, this, of course, will be available on the I4C website for the next 90 days. So we'll all be able to look at it more closely and capture all the key points that have come up. But I would like to thank all the panelists for making some really important interventions and putting the whole issue and the role of carbon pricing in the overall context of climate action, and indeed in the overall context of sustainable development. So thank you very much for those interventions. And I would also like to thank all the participants who have actually asked the questions, but also have listened to all the panelists closely. So with this, we would like to close this session, and we look forward to having all of you in several other workshops and also the plenary that is going to take place tomorrow at the I4C. So thank you very much and have a good day.